Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We're moving on to the last panel of our conference, which is the chronologically most recent, and the first lecture for the last panel is Adela HΗNCU from New Europe College in Bucharest. Adela, can we hear each other?
Yes, I can hear you.
So please continue with your paper.
Thank you. I will share my screen because I have prepared a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Just a second. Right. Here it goes. So good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me today to present my research and also to be part of the conversation. My talk today draws on the research I conducted for my dissertation that I defended at Central European University. But like Jan in the first session of the day, my interest is more theoretical and methodological, in the hope that other researchers working on the semi-peripheries and from the semi-peripheries might relate to some of the issues that I have encountered in my own work. So in the first part of the presentation, I would like to briefly review the kind of theoretical frameworks in which intellectual autonomy seems to be central in accounts of intellectual production under state socialism. Then I would like to discuss a mixed methodological approach that I employed in my research that mixes institutional, intellectual, history of science, and also oral history. And I would like to do this not just to discuss the different the positives and the negatives of each of these methodological approaches, but also in order to argue that different methodologies are not just personal choices of researchers, but they are made inevitable by the research conditions on the ground, which vary from country to country. And then in the last part of my presentation, I will give some examples from my work on sociological knowledge production in state socialist Romania after 1966. On to the theoretical frameworks, I begin with the Totalitarian Theorem, and here, in order to illustrate the totalitarian theory, I chose an unusual book. This is the Bauer, Inkeles, and Klukenhorn, How the Soviet System Works, from 1956. I chose this book and not another, just to remind us that the totalitarian approach in Soviet studies, even as early as the mid-1950s, was much more complex than it is often caricaturized later on. So, for example, How the Soviet System Works is based on over 1,000 in-depth interviews that were conducted with Soviet emigres in Germany and the US from the early 1950s. And the project, concerned as it was with the workings of the Soviet system, was also, as the documentation around it shows, very much mired with epistemic anxieties about how data is collected, classified, and interpreted, and also with the problems of interviewing and the life stories. So not that unlike the problems of oral historians today. On the topic of the intelligentsia, the book had to say that the regime, while encouraging the intelligentsia to take initiative, to be bold, and be at the same time was concerned with keeping a close control over the actions of the intellectuals and artists and intellectuals in particular. So the generators of new ideas were considered extremely risky for both individual and for the state in a totalitarian system. So here is, in a way, the classical distinction between intellectual autonomy and censorship and repression. But I would like again to remind us, revisionists and post-revisionists, that the totalitarian approach also accommodated the existence of a continuum on which different cases from collaboration to dissent fall, and that it very much was able to accommodate individual stories or life stories. The second approach is the anthropological theory of the late 1980s and early 1990s. This comes from the work of foreign, mostly American anthropologists who traveled to the so-called Eastern Bloc And I give here the example of Catherine Verdery and national ideology under socialism, not just because it's on the case of Romania, but because it is possibly the most iconic anthropological work on cultural production under state socialism. So what is specific to this kind of theorizing that builds on the one hand on local Marxist indigenous theories, and on the other hand on the Bourdieu theory of or notions of cultural and symbolic capital. What is specific to this form of theorizing is that it looks at the structural constraints in which actors produced knowledge, on which they competed over knowledge under condition of shortage economy. But on the other hand, it argues that the competition was there and was structural, regardless of whether the actors themselves believed that they are autonomous or not. So actors reproduce the system of domination regardless of their own perception of their own actions. And the third, so here is a quote, and the third and final theory that I would like to invoke very briefly, because I assume this is the most well-known among historians of state socialism, that is the post-revisionist theory. Here is Stephen Kotkin's magnetic mountain and the by now very well-known theory that Stalinism was not just a project of state building by means of destruction of society, but also a civilizational project, in the sense that it created along with the state a new society, and that it was not just intellectuals but all social actors that learned to speak Bolshevik and to advance their own goals in this discourse broadly construed. Importantly, post-revisionism and especially the subjective turn also problematized the source base of pre-existing scholarship on state socialism, that is the archives, by arguing that archives are created in conversation with the constructivist agenda of Soviet power. And in many cases, the intellectual categories of the Soviet state become the organizing categories of the archives themselves. So this is this has been a very important insight for all subsequent research on state socialist knowledge production. So very briefly, my argument here would be that both the anthropological theories and the post-revisionist theories share a certain dialectical sensitivity in their approach to state socialism. That is, they integrate the dichotomies assumed in the simplified version of the totalitarian theory, like state and society, collaboration and resistance, or autonomy and subservience. But now moving to my methodological discussion, I would like to ask if a mixed methodological approach that accounts for institutions, for epistemology, for individual experience can move us theoretically beyond not just the dichotomic model of the totalitarian theory, but also the dialectical model of the anthropological and post-revisionist theory. And I would like to argue that one way to do this is to historicize analytical concepts that we use, such as autonomy, but also other central concepts of the historiography of state socialism. So this is a very busy slide, but I will go through it very fast. It is basically a summary of these three main methodological approaches that one can identify in the study of intellectual production under state socialism, and the drawbacks of each. What I would like to particularly draw attention to is that each of these approaches stems, again, not just from the individual preferences of researchers, and not just from their theoretical propensities, but also from the realities of the researching on the ground. So they stem from the absence or presence of certain archives, from the absence or presence of sources, from the willingness or unwillingness of actors to discuss in oral history interviews. So institutional history, and I include the state as an institution, ranges from the very broadest studies of state policies to micro-histories of localized arrangements at the level of institutions. Here the focus is on the structural opportunities and constraints in which actors did their intellectual work. And it is usually based on archival sources, which are, however, overwhelmingly biased towards a top-down approach and towards cases of dissent. This, for instance, is compounded in the case of Romania by the fact that the most easily accessible archives are the archives of the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party and the archive of the Secret Police. So this is a situation in which even the most painstaking work of reconstruction of the bureaucratic processes behind knowledge production reproduces this bias, this top-down bias, and also this bias for bureaucratically processing cases that deviate from the norm, so cases of dissent. In the case of intellectual history and the history of science, here the focus is on reconstructing the epistemic assumptions historically on their own terms. The focus is on discourse, on habitus, on practices of knowledge production, and the sources are abundant. My point here is that even though there has been a tremendous amount of research on cases of censorship or unpublished texts, the so-called shelf literature, actually the problem of intellectual history is not with the texts that were not published, but with the huge material of works that were published. Here other issues of intellectual history that I would like to just mention is that these sources tend to be self-referential, and also they tend to require knowledge or literacy in complex languages. For instance, in my case, in Marxism-Leninism, which is an intellectual language that many have lost proficiency in and which is very difficult to reconstruct. On the issue of oral history and life stories, these offer direct accounts of the experience of the participant themselves in their own words. But as we know, oral history is mired with many methodological issues. For instance, it's very dependent on the context of the interview and on the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer. So there has been a lot of discussion about these problems, and one solution has been to think of oral history as giving access, as James Mark argued among others, to the range of acceptable stories that individuals had at the moment of the interview, rather than like on validating the content itself. So oral history as a way to discuss memory politics and the general context at the time of the production of these life stories. Now, moving to the case study of the new sociologists, these are the sociologists that were trained in state socialist Romania beginning in 1966, when a new department for sociology was established at the University of Bucharest. So what I see by looking at almost 50 oral history interviews with sociologists trained at that time is that their career paths, so their institutional context, their training or their epistemic context, and the way that they discuss autonomy, intellectual autonomy in oral history interviews are tied together. So, for instance, the first cohorts of sociologists that were trained from 1966 mostly ended up working in research and in higher education after graduation. They were trained in a mix of Marxist sociology, American structural functionalism, and they especially remembered the experience of field research in these big research projects that were carried out at the time on industrialization and urbanization. The second group of cohorts of sociologists were trained in a different epistemic context, when the focus in sociology was mostly on quantitative methods and on the connections between sociology and scientific management or cybernetics, and the role of sociology in planning and in rationalizing centralized planning. These were also students that were coming with a different intellectual background into sociology. They were interested in the social movements going on in the West, in the students' protests in Paris, in the new left. And they ended up, because of the switch in epistemic context of the discipline, they ended up in local public institutions, such as factory, personnel offices, or labor offices, where they were slowly disillusioned. The last cohorts that graduated after 1977 did not graduate as sociologists at all. So what happened is that the department was disbanded. So they ended up working as professors of philosophy or of history in high schools in the provinces. So given these different institutional and epistemic contexts, these different cohorts of sociologists discuss self-thematize in different terms. The first cohorts are the ones most likely to discuss their career paths in terms of science versus ideology, or scientific autonomy versus political dependence. They discuss very often the unfulfilled promises of sociology. For instance, here, one sociologist says that the topics were failed from the beginning, that they were false, that they were practicing as if on a plane that was never going to fly and just saw the control panel. Another sociologist from this cohort was particularly interested in discussing the discrepancy between what they had seen in the field and the shiny packaging, the ideological infusion, the overflowing optimism in which the information was delivered in the published report. So for this cohort, indeed, the distinction was between science and ideology, and they discuss also at length issues of political compromises or how they were choosing their topic so that it was so that it offered them the most possible autonomy. For the second cohort of sociologists, the distinction was more between theory and methodology, but not in the way it is then in the post-socialist period, again believed to signify ideology and science. For instance, one former student says that the faculty of sociology was an ideological faculty, but by this he did not mean that sociology was non-ideological, but that the faculty was dogmatic rather than revisionist. And then another graduate says that he was more interested in measuring than the philosophy of measuring, which can be taken as a statement about empirical sociology. On the other hand, he was tortured by the problems of Marxist theory and its conceptual apparatus. So again, like what we can see from this is that theory and methodology, or empirical science and ideology, were not dichotomical in the sense that it was then portrayed in the post-socialist period. And finally, the last cohorts of sociologists who have a lot of remorse about how their careers end up, talk about their positions in high schools as a thing so inelegant it still haunts me today, or a period of penitence. And for them, the distinction is not between ideology and science, but between sociology and non-sociology. They discuss at length the kind of what they had to do to keep interest in their intellectual intellectual topics that they had studied during the university, either by becoming literary critics or journalists and so on. So my point here is that by looking at the institutional context, together with the epistemic context and with oral history interviews, we get a better picture of how these intertwined. And so on the issue of autonomy specifically, whereas this was central to theories of intellectual production under state socialism, different methodologies can show different methodologies that actually are dependent on the different research reality, the real existing realities of archival and historical research. So different methodologies together with different theories can produce new theorizing on knowledge production under state socialism. That includes both issues of agency that were missing from the anthropological theories, and from the post-revisionist theories and issues of structural constraints that were so central to the totalitarian theory, and which actually are the most easily accessible through the archives that are now available to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Adela, for this insightful lecture on sociological thought. And now to move on, we have Anna ANTIĆ from University of Copenhagen. Anna, can we hear each other?
Yep. Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
If I can. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, you can see. Okay. Let me just. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk at this event, and I'll talk about the project I've been working on for a few months now. Well, more than that, but officially a few months, which actually focuses on the history of transcultural psychiatry as a relatively new discipline, which appears in a new guise in the mid-20th century. So after the end of the Second World War and during decolonisation in particular, and is directly in a direct dialogue with the processes of decolonisation, as a discipline which very much sits at the intersection between psychiatry, psychology and anthropology in particular at this time, and which develops, as I said, as a sort of response, firstly from the Western centers of knowledge production, and then kind of spreads across the globe as a response to these pressures, political and social pressures of decolonization. And my argument in this project is that transcultural psychiatry is in fact an attempt at first by these Western practitioners to reconsider their own discipline and its role, its historical role in supporting the structures and the institutions of colonialism, right, and colonial oppression. But at the same time, it is a really important field of research, precisely because its core aim is to involve practitioners, experts, but also patients, right, from other parts of the world outside these Western centers of knowledge production. And the point of transcultural psychiatry as a discipline was to provide a new platform for a more inclusive communication between Western and non-Western, for lack of better expression, experts, and also systems of knowledge and systems of understandings of mental illness and mental healing, right? And so what really interests me in this development in this history is in fact how that communication between this very new communication between these different experts and different systems of knowledge developed, and to what extent what was the role of these experts from both the global south and then the second world, right, Eastern Europe and socialist world. What was their role in redefining this new global discipline of transcultural psychiatry, and to what extent was transcultural psychiatry successful in removing itself from these erstwhile colonial conceptual frameworks? It wasn't very successful, just to say that in the beginning, but I do focus on the role of people who were not experts, who were not coming from these traditional Western centers, and I explore how they grappled with these lingering colonial influences. And so this is just a quote, talk about utopian psychiatry. So this is what they were trying to do in mid-20th century, believed that because they had the knowledge of the force of human nature, psychiatrists, right, that entitles them to take large part in studying and helping people who are not suffering from any mental disease, as well as in advising on human relations between people and even between communities and nations, right? And so psychiatry at this time, as it attempts to decolonize, kind of sets itself up as a really important facilitator of cross-cultural dialogue, and also a really important actor in understanding, really important actor in a kind of reconstruction, post-reconstruction, in kind of understanding the basic psychological mechanism which will help us prevent future war and violence. And precisely because of that, transcultural psychiatry in its moment of decolonization really adopts universalism. This historians have called ideological universalism as its main paradigm, right? So while colonial psychiatry focuses, well, it's a complicated story, but traditional colonial ethnopsychiatry focused mostly on cultural differences and ordered them in a hierarchical way, right? Universalism is at this moment could also kind of function as a tool of anti-colonialism, as a rather progressive and a liberal paradigm, which reestablishes this kind of this unity, this common humanity and cultural and biological unity of humankind, right? And so this is how this universalist psychiatry in the mid-20th century becomes a place where the very boundaries of humanity become redrawn and extended to include ever larger number of communities, human communities. And so here's some examples. This is all coming from the Western psychiatrists. What do they say when they talk about the kind of the role between the human mind and cultural difference, right? They say, this John Rees, this head of the Tavistock Clinic, he says, I have visited many countries in the world, and I believe there are I don't believe that there are fundamental differences or basic differences, right? Between anything I had in Africa and things you find in other countries. Africa's not a country, but I'm not sure if he's aware, except naturally in the cultural determinants, right? And so there's this kind of this almost sort of dismissal of cultural difference as just a veneer that falls off if you look closely enough. Same here. I think Ari Kiev, who's from New York, says similar things. Mental illness is manifested in certain basic structural mechanisms and processes in the different clinical syndromes, providing a substratum on top of which different cultures impose differences in context. So in that sense, cultures, as I said, are just a kind of an outer layer where there is a basic similarity and a basic sameness of the core of illness, but also of the core of the mind. So there's this kind of universal global psyche, and everything else is comparable. And so this is a setting which allows, ideally, for these kind of utopian interventions and a much more egalitarian communication between East and West. Of course, between West and, well, between global North and global South, I guess. So between different these communities. However, and this is one of the studies that's really representative of this new way of thinking, the WHO-funded IPSS, which included 9 different research centers in the world. US and UK, but also the Soviet Union, and then Nigeria and Colombia, Taiwan, India, right? So there's this kind of global scope. They try to understand whether schizophrenia can actually be diagnosed is kind of whether it's a universal diagnosis and whether it can be diagnosed with a universal standardized research instruments. And so this is also an example of that kind of new universalism, but also new optimism that now there can be, just by this point, so very, very soon after this kind of very problematic, hierarchical, racist, colonial psychiatric theorizing, now we have a situation in which colleagues from Nigeria and Colombia and India are kind of part on the same footing, a part of the same project as colleagues from the UK and the US and Denmark, etc. So in that sense, there is this kind of an attempt at inclusivity. However, what really emerges as a problem very early on and then continues throughout the second half of the 20th century is, of course, that this transcultural psychiatry in its universalist framework has lots of problems and lots of internal incoherences and suffers from the lingering influences of colonial hierarchical thinking and evolutionary thinking. So one of the main problems is that kind of lingering preoccupation with culture, with cultural difference, and especially very narrowly defined culture, which tends to exoticize and reify particular cultural and social communities, and also kind of focuses psychiatric exploration on cultural difference within this context, universalism, to the exclusion of social, economic, and political factors and determinants, which could actually work better to create a comparative framework. But so there is this kind of lingering colonial almost preoccupation with exotic cultural difference and culture as kind of ethnic or religious trait rather than a kind of broader socioeconomic exploration. Because of that, partly transcultural psychiatry, especially as it develops in the Western context, focuses, I mean, they want to be facilitators of cross-cultural communication, but I also see that, again, as part of this, the colonial theorizing, they see cross-cultural change and cross-cultural contact and like different cultural influences in a particular community as a source of pathology. And it's very much, and it's in particular, the cultural change and modernizing change within developing, right, and kind of underdeveloped communities is a source of pathology rather than kind of developmental opportunity, etc. And in more explicit ways, there's a persistence of colonial framework and colonial knowledge evolutionary thinking, which means that global South and sort of developing communities and societies are seen as kind of stuck at an earlier stage of development, of civilizational development. So this sort of infantilism thesis that non-Western societies, some of them are kind of representative of the earlier stages of development of European civilizations, but also this tendency to kind of to understand cultural difference and differences in expressions of mental illness in hierarchical, to order them in hierarchical terms. And one of my favorite examples, I mean, favorite in a negative way, is this one of the conclusions of Julian Leff, the leader of this IPSS study in the UK, who developed this theory of languages of emotions, where he kind of ordered societies from developing to developed and argued that the languages of emotion, of negative emotion in particular, in developing societies are fossilized. So they are at an earlier stages of development because they don't differentiate very well between different forms of negative emotions like depression, anxiety, etc. So it's all undifferentiated. And as societies climb up civilizationally, you get ever more differentiated expressions and concepts for these emotions, like for instance in English or in French. And so this is happening in the 1970s, so really quite late in the day. And within the concept of universalism, but his analysis is really not that much different from colonial thinking and from the infantilism thesis that I mentioned. Right? It's this kind of development for this kind of evolutionary development. But the problem is, of course, if you think of certain countries and societies and communities that are stuck at a kind of a previous developmental stage, then it will take, it's very kind of pessimistic in terms of developmental and modernizing options and prospects, because it will take much longer for these communities at the childhood stage of civilization, right, to catch up. And it's a thinking in terms of catching up. And so this has been obviously this criticized as category fallacy, right? And this is one of these anthropological critiques from the 80s and 90s, that European psychiatrists took their categories out of societies and assumed that if those societies don't have those exact categories that come from Western societies, then they're kind of underdeveloped, and that this is a problem, that cultural patterns in different societies have to be more or less accurate approximations of the Western classification, which is the only real one. And so to come to the periphery or the semi-periphery, what's really important, what's really, I think, interesting in the story of transcultural psychiatry is that experts from the global South and from Socialist East and from Yugoslavia, Socialist Eastern Europe, actually attempted to offer correctives to this, and very important and imaginative alternatives to these conceptualizations of the global mind. So how do you bridge this gap? between different cultural conceptualizations, and how do you undermine this hierarchical view within which Western medicine is the ultimate the ultimate true knowledge system. Well, many people from the decolonizing societies really focused on non-Western concepts and non-Western systems of knowledge and their role in the development of modern cross-cultural psychiatry. And my favorite example is from India, where a group of researchers from Delhi really kind of talked about the Indian universalist tradition of psychotherapy, autochthonous Indian tradition of universalist psychotherapy, which focuses on humankind rather than on individual patients like Western psychiatry. And they argued that I think this Indian tradition is much more useful as the norm for future universalist transcultural global psychiatry, much more conducive to that than these Western traditions which are being imposed around the world. What's really important, and this is something where Yugoslav psychiatrists played a big role as Marxists who focused on socioeconomic determinants of mental health and sociological analysis, is that one way to undermine the colonial frameworks in transcultural psychiatry is to focus not on cultural difference, right, in this cultural, reifying, narrowly defined culture, religion, ethnic differences, but to focus on social psychiatry and sociological and social categories within different communities and how they shape mental health. Again, a famous example of this is this Cornell Arrow mental health study, which was a collaboration between a Canadian and a Nigerian group of psychiatrists, which focused on the concept of social disintegration as a factor, as a core determinant of mental health. Rather than any kind of issue of cultural clash or cultural change or this kind of malicious cultural difference, right? And so they focused on issues of social disintegration within communities, and then placed both Canadian and Nigerian rural communities within the same analytical framework, and drew really convincing parallels. From Eastern Europe in particular, and I worked in this particular Yugoslav psychiatry, well, several of them, but one of my one of my most important case studies was Vladimir Jakovljević, who actually comes from the University of Zagreb, then worked in Belgrade and in Macedonia, and then went to Guinea and France and Guinea to do his transcultural research. And what comes out from his research is this alternative non-Western form of universalism. So unlike this Western universalism, which comes out of this post-colonial guilt, but is also very much infused with colonial thinking and can't move away from hierarchical and evolutionary thinking. This alternative kind of the socialist idea of universalism is based on solidarity, on a particular sense of solidarity between, say, Eastern Europe as a region, and in the case of Jakovljević, Africa, or kind of West Africa as a region. So there's this uncertain geopolitical position of Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia in Europe plays an important role. So it's unclear whether Yugoslavia is closer to Africa or to France, to Western Europe in its sort of civilizational development in Jakovljević's reading. And in that sense, there is a sense of solidarity, which is not always explicit, but there is also an implicit drawing of historical parallels between historical experiences and stages of development, and kind of this history of oppression between both Yugoslavia or Eastern Europe and Africa. And so that kind of universalism, solidarity, leads to a different view of kind of cultural comparisons and the global mind, because it is kind of, so if you are a kind of Yugoslav psychiatrist who was working in Macedonia, you see lots of similarities in, as they say, backwardness, right, between these different global regions, right? And so they maintain these social psychiatrists, they maintain this problematic narrative of civilization versus primitivism, and of course they see Europe as the civilized norm, but there's lots of ways in which implicitly or even perhaps unintentionally this evolutionary narrative is undermined in their writing because precisely of that solidarity and that similarity that they feel between their own experiences and experiences of the other in Africa. And because of that, it's kind of moving away from this infantilism thesis in socialist transcultural psychiatry. Because of course, whatever they say about Africa and its development or not will at the same time refer to Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia. It will be as relevant for Eastern Europe. So if Africa is stuck at the childhood stage of civilizational development, then the same goes for Yugoslavia, and it doesn't really bode very well for modernization and socialist revolution. So there is much more developmental optimism within that alternative psychiatric system. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anna, for the interesting paper shared with us. And now for the last lecture, Vedran DUANČIĆ from the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and your yesterday's host. Please, Vedran, you may present your research.
Hi, everyone. So welcome to the almost end. My paper is titled The Brotherhood of Equals, Science and Technology Transfers Among the Non-Aligned Countries During the Cold War. And my talk today belongs to the work in progress genre, meaning that it comes at a point in the development of research when you know a lot about something, but you're not necessarily sure what to do with all that knowledge. And this is something I've been working on for some time as part of the project led by Professor Dugac at the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts, but also something that will eventually turn into a larger project of its own because it's a big topic. And because of its size, today I will offer an overview, thinking aloud about certain methodological issues. So, if you have any personal or professional relation to former Yugoslavia, as a large part of the audience does, you will know of the non-aligned movement and organization of countries, mostly from the so-called Third World, which called for peaceful coexistence and economic development beyond the Cold War divisions. In its heyday, the NAM, whose membership had grown from 25 countries at the 1961 inaugural meeting in Belgrade to well over 100 countries and liberation movements, exerted a considerable influence in global affairs, but has largely lost the rationale for its existence and has seen its influence greatly diminish since the end of the Cold War. You also probably have an idea of Yugoslav non-aligned engagement as a differentia specifica separating socialist Yugoslavia from socialist countries of the Eastern Bloc. Well, if that's the case, that means you probably haven't been reading much of the recent literature on the Cold War. It's been almost 20 years since the notion of the Iron Curtain gave way to more nuanced alternatives such as the Nylon Curtain and the likes. Federated world is another such apt term. The curtain and its effects were real, make no mistake, but for some people, in some places, in some periods, it appeared translucent and permeable. Rather than a time of a strict separation fueled by ideological and geopolitical antagonisms, the Cold War has for some time now been reframed as a time of global entanglement of a specific kind, a time of trans-systemic communication that was limited, precarious, controlled, but that existed nonetheless. What then was so special about socialist Yugoslavia if everyone else also transgressed the borders? That the Soviet Union had a global agenda and worked on realizing it was never disputed. Once the Soviet East European satellites were no longer seen as mere enforced copies, forming a monolithic ideological geopolitical bloc, but entities with at least some agency of their own, who occasionally worked against each other and even against the interests and wishes of the Soviet Union, their global ambitions came to light too. This historiographical development also has implications for Yugoslavia. If, as historians have shown, agronomy, engineering, or medicine students from Algiers, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, etc., were to be seen in the streets of the DDR, Hungary, or Romania, and vice versa, socialist experts in the construction sites hospitals, and fields of the third world countries. Again, what was so special about socialist Yugoslavia? For beginning, size, that is, better to say, scale matters. And the scale, ambition, and importance ascribed to the cooperation of the members of the Eastern Bloc with the non-aligned developing countries pale in comparison to Yugoslavia's engagement. But let's take a step back to gain some methodological perspective. For decades, overviews of the history of NAM, studies of engagement of individual countries with it, or histories of cooperation and conflicts within it have all focused on international relations, activities of heads of states, and geopolitical concerns. The long-standing hegemony of diplomatic history has neglected one of the movement's main goals: peaceful cooperation aiming at improving living conditions and fostering economic growth in developing countries. And there it is, front and center in the declaration from the 1955 Bandung Conference, one of the prequels that led to the formal establishment of the non-aligned movement at its first summit in Belgrade in 1961. Section A of the Bandung Declaration is titled Economic Cooperation, even though scientific and technological cooperation would have been an equally, if not a more precise title. Admittedly, the frequency of mentions of science and technology and emphasis put on it in declarations from the later NAM summits would vary, with science and technology, for instance, being mentioned, I think, only once in the declaration from the Colombo summit in 1976, I think. Nevertheless, mentions of scientific technological cooperation in service of economic development were neither accidental nor marginal. A precise definition of scientific technological cooperation, however, proved to be elusive. It was a blanket term encompassing a variety of goods and services, from blueprints for grain silos and irrigation systems, hydrological surveys, student exchange, shipbuilding, to vaccines and beyond. And although always listed together, the technology part of the dyad clearly carried more weight in practice. Most developing countries, not only NAM members, aspired to recreate scientific complexes entirely or partially and implement specific scientific knowledge and technology from the more advanced countries of the first world, either their former European colonial centers or increasingly the United States, or even the second world, which was also keen on scientific technological exports to developing countries for geopolitical and more mundane economic reasons. But developing countries often found turning to each other, to other developing countries for certain types of knowledge, personnel, or science and technology-related investments to be cheaper, if not quicker, and it was often politically beneficial too. Facing shortages of hard currency, developing countries resorted to paying in kind, and oil was a preferred alternative for various forms of mutual cooperation and investment, which in turn complicated the process and even served as a disincentive for future cooperation. The science, diplomacy, and cooperation that was initially heavily influenced by revolutionary, national liberation, and anti-imperialist agendas of the 1950s and 1960s became more pragmatic and concerned with economic efficiency by the late 1970s, when it also started yielding fewer tangible results. The cooperation within NAM during the late phase of the Cold War poses a methodological challenge. Not only were its earlier revolutionary connotations subdued, but the overall decrease in cooperation, though not in all fields equally, was a result of a combination of global, regional, variety of national, micro-regional reconfigurations that are not necessarily readily observable from any single point of view. The core issue of the history of scientific technological cooperation within NAM is horizontal transfer, not the transfer of knowledge and technology from developed to developing countries, but the very idea and attempts at cooperation among the developing countries themselves. NAM serves as a particularly convenient research framework in that regard. If it sounds great, that's because it is great, but some sort of research caution is advised lest we fall victims of a trap of simplifying and romanticizing, for there are several catches. First, the cooperation among developing countries by no means precluded the classical type of transfers from developed to less developed or developing countries. This was continuously and explicitly stated in a declaration after declaration. I cannot quantify this, at least not for now, But it seems that both on the level of plans and on the execution of these plans, scientific technological cooperation among the developing countries was a supplementary strategy meant to be employed alongside transfers from developed countries. This diversification was linked to the contemporary belief that quick-paced scientific technological development was a crucial precondition for sustainable independence. Second, the very proposition of scientific technological cooperation among supposedly equal and friendly countries in light of post-colonial dependencies, national liberation, and state-building efforts was often challenged in practice. Competition for particularly lucrative tenders tended to pit supposed non-aligned allies against each other. This is a very frustrating issue for me because different contracts were negotiated and awarded in different ways. So I'm not yet entirely sure how to deal with that confusion. In any case, the scientific knowledge, personnel, and infrastructure should be seen as diplomatic and economic resources, which was an understanding shared by government officials as well as the experts involved. Third, NAM was an asymmetric organization whose members exerted different levels of different capital, different levels of different kinds of capital, economic, diplomatic, military, technological, etc. This is an opportunity to bring socialist Yugoslavia back to the story because Yugoslavia was eager to profit from its relative advantage in cooperation with countries, not all of them full NAM members, as diverse as Algeria, Angola, Brazil, China, Cuba, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Libya, Nigeria, Sudan, etc. This is obviously not a comprehensive list, there are just a list of cases that I know something about. And the logic was often simple. It went something like this. Look, our Yugoslav turbines, for instance, will never be the best or the cheapest. But if 3 out of 10 Ethiopian engineers will be trained on them here in Yugoslavia, even if at our expense, our offer to supply Ethiopia with turbines will be assessed in a more favorable light. The problem with such logic, of course, was that everyone thought of the same thing, so no one in the end really had the edge. The cooperation with other developing countries was made into a cornerstone of Yugoslavia's identity, both domestically and internationally, and it was hoped it would help boost the economy that started faltering in the early 1960s when an earlier expansionist model based on state investments in heavy industry producing for a domestic market was abandoned in favor of joining global markets and coupled by a retreat of the state from the commanding position in the economy, but also in financing scientific research. Despite certain financial successes, most notably in the field of civil engineering, with Yugoslavia's construction companies winning lucrative contracts and building dams, bridges, roads, power stations, schools, and tens of thousands of housing units, most spectacularly in Algeria, the overall economic results of Yugoslavia's engagement with NAM did not meet expectations. Yet it remained important, even in the 1980s, for the country's international prestige and was profitable enough for the state to keep pursuing it by mediating between foreign governments and individual institutions and companies throughout Yugoslavia. But if they wanted to export their expertise and technology, directors of research institutes, for instance, had no choice but to act as directors of commercial enterprises. In a meeting in March 1974, one of many meetings dedicated to rethinking Yugoslavia's position within NAM from a perspective other than high diplomacy, a wonderful, ambitious, and entirely unrealistic suggestion was made. Yugoslavia, whose scientific technological cooperation with non-aligned countries had actually been decreasing, not least because of the 1973 oil crisis and the ensuing economic crisis, should position itself as no less than a coordinator of all scientific technological cooperation within the movement, even in instances where it did not take part. That, as is clear, did not happen. There were 3 dominant fields of cooperation: agriculture, civil engineering, admittedly a notion too broad to be of much use really, and medicine. Thousands of physicians from developing countries from across the world were educated at Yugoslavia's universities, and thousands more were sent from Yugoslavia to the Middle East and Africa to practice and teach. Medicine cooperation with Libya and Syria in that regard was exceptionally large. Also sent from Yugoslavia were domestically produced drugs and vaccines. I'm mentioning this because vaccines, including the extremely successful Zagreb measles vaccine licensed in 1967 were a particular source of national pride, because this was a field where socialist Yugoslavia, a developing country, had actually caught up and could compete with the much more advanced countries and earn the much needed hard currency through export. The largely successful cooperation in the field of medicine, however, also speaks of tensions between what was classified as basic and applied science and between investments that generated economic results directly and investments whose effects resisted an easy classification. The bottom line in the case of building dams and bridges was much clearer than in the case of educating foreign or sending local nurses and physicians abroad, which complicates the motivations as well as the assessments of the results of this type of cooperation. In the 1960s, just when cooperation with NAM was intensifying, the notion of self-managerial socialism in Yugoslavia was expanded to include a sort of self-investment too. Companies were expected to generate profit and rely on themselves for future investments, which separated the relatively successful companies from a considerable number of non-profitable ones. The strict budgetary rules seemed to have had a tremendous, though yet insufficiently elucidated, effects on investments in scientific research and development. The logic of makers versus takers can also help guide the research of the so-called non-aligned science. The logic complicated the process of deciding who would pay and how big of a share for individual cases of scientific technological cooperation. But it also suggests that the Yugoslav side saw certain lines of cooperation, such as prominently medicine, as important enough not to apply the strict logic of profitability to them. And there's a fundamental problem to everything I've said so far. It's that a movement consciously and deliberately decentered, as the non-aligned movement was, cannot clearly be studied from one perspective alone, even if it is important and insightful, as the case of Yugoslavia's engagement in scientific technological cooperation undoubtedly was. Now, in a way of conclusion, my perhaps overly ambitious plan is to use the case of Yugoslavia as a privileged entry point into this parallel and alternative global network of scientific and technological exchange during the Cold War. In doing so, the shift from reception studies, which tended to reinforce center-periphery hierarchies and dichotomies, to studies of appropriation of knowledge and technology, which ascribed more agency to the receiver, and further shift to the reimagining of scientific production as plurilocal and always in motion, provides hopefully the vital conceptual underpinnings of my effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vedran, for sharing your insights into the role, the mechanisms of knowledge fluctuation in the unaligned movement and the Yugoslav war, role in it. And now I would like to open the floor for discussion. Does anyone have any remarks, questions?
Maybe if should someone feel the urge to comment on something that we've heard before, I don't think we have to necessarily abide to the schedule, because we now have two Q&As, basically one after another. So we theoretically could join both into one larger. If anything, if anyone has anything to ask or comment, to suggest.
But
I mean, while other people are collecting their thoughts, hopefully, I have a question for Anna, maybe in anticipation of the results of her project. I mean, it considers kind of bridging the gap between our interests. In terms of institutional, can you tell us more about in terms of institutional collaboration, or I mean, where is the space that this bridging took place?
So thank you, Vedran. The international institutions that are the kind of the usual spaces, the usual culprits, like obviously the WHO, but in this case also something called the World Federation for Mental Health, and such institutions, and then the regional offices for WHO, especially for mental health, in different parts of the world. So within these institutions, experts from Yugoslavia, but also from the decolonizing territory, other actually non-aligned countries mostly, would act as experts and would sometimes actually be sent on particular tasks and particular missions, right, to explore the state of institutions and mental health developments in different parts of the world. But then some of these people actually took up very important roles, like managing roles or managerial roles in these leading international institutions, and that was also quite striking in the 50s and 60s and sort of probably 70s, to what extent the people from outside the Western centers actually held important roles and could shape policies. But in terms of actual collaboration between, kind of going around the Western centers and sort of direct collaborations between the second and the third worlds, it's the training programs that you mentioned that really mattered a lot. So when socialist psychiatrists went to Global South, they went to train personnel primarily and to set up this. And so in that sense, hospitals, local hospitals, but also local universities are the spaces where these collaborations happened most often. So it's not sometimes nothing particularly high ranking or particularly international as such could become space for this really quite unique global collaboration.
And maybe a follow-up question in terms of methodological question in terms of assessing the impacts of these transfers. I mean, in my case, very often they admit that they're not sure they did much. They come back home and we have no idea what we just did. So,
well, I don't know. Yeah, I think in the case of Yakovlevich, I like this because when I talk about psychiatrists, so psychiatrists are not among the people who were sent in these technical assistance missions most often, and I don't actually know of any other East European psychiatrists other than the Yugoslav, the ones that I know from Yugoslavia. So you could say that the influences are really small, minuscule, but I think in his case, I think he actually set up with his team the mental health system of Guinea, like the entire mental health system of Guinea, which I think is not a small achievement. But I don't know. I mean, I think in terms of just speaking more generally, I think global mental health or like global psychiatric landscape has changed quite a lot in the last decades with that kind of the rise of biological and biomedical framework, and in that sense these really interesting and nuanced and sophisticated contributions of people from the second world and the third world have been lost to a large extent. So sort of globally speaking, I think I would say my evaluation is more pessimistic.
I actually do have not a question, but a technical remark that I was supposed to say at the very beginning and then didn't. And then I think now might be a good time to mention that. So first of all, a Croatian historical journal, Radovi Zavoda za Hrvatsku povijest, the proceedings of the Institute for Croatian History will be sending out an invitation for everyone who wants to contribute to a special issue arising in some way, shape, or form from our conference, there will be a follow-up email on that. It will be the preferred language is English, though I think German and theoretically even French are admissible, though I don't think anyone has seen a French article in there in decades. And sorry. Okay, but you will get an email, separate email about that. Just a general framework. Should anyone be interested, the deadline for submitting papers will be, I think, September 1st, 2021. So 8 months, 8 months from now. If there are no further questions, sorry, Nico, you're actually the moderator today, so I'm gonna mute myself and let you say goodbye to everyone. If
no, I mean the last panel, actually it was very interesting for me, but not being an expert in the 20th or late 20th century, I don't think that I can really contribute much to the discussion, particularly because it was so theoretically and methodologically developed. So really, if there are no other questions, then I would like to thank all of the participants in the name of the organizing committee and in the name of team members of both the co-organizing projects. I think that your papers, sharing your papers, your researchers has really contributed to making this conference insightful and stimulating in terms of further research in the field of knowledge circulation and knowledge production. I think that is all. I want you to stay healthy, stay safe, and hope to see you soon on another project or at another conference. That is all. Have a nice day.
Hi.
Hi.
Can I say a word?
Yeah, definitely, sure.
Of course.
I would like to thank our two young colleagues, Vedran DUANČIĆ and Zrinko Novosel, for guiding us through the conference and for everyone they made for this conference to make happen. And I would like to thank two of our colleagues from Croatian Institute of History, Tomislav and Krešimir, who worked behind the scenes and for their technical support. That's all of me. Thank you all for participating and goodbye.